Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback. What role can performance play in racial justice struggles? How can theater help us remake the world? The past several months have made even more urgent the centuries-long fight to dismantle the anti-blackness and Orientalism that are baked into our social institutions. Such transformations are at the heart of the pedagogy, scholarship, and dramaturgy produced by today's guest, playwright Dorinne Kondo. Dorinne's work traces what she calls reparative creativity, or the way that artists make, remake, and unmake race through their creative work. In our interview, Dorinne and I talk about how Asian American theater companies are reshaping what liveness means in the context of COVID-19, the powerful role of performance in recent protests against the state-sponsored killing of Black people, how norms of ability and disability are built into the very structure of theater, and why theorizing a new relationship to vulnerability is key to how Dorinne imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm delighted. Thank you for having me.
So live performance is one of the very many creative industries that have been pretty powerfully changed these days by COVID-19. So I'd maybe love to start off our conversation today by talking about, as a playwright, how have you been adapting your theater and performance work in this time, or maybe the way that you approach theater and performance work?
As a playwright at the moment, I'm just finishing up the semester, but I will say that different theaters around the country are adopting different kinds of strategies to cope with these new circumstances. For example, East-West Players, the oldest continuously running theater of color in the country, I emphasize continuously running, which sponsored the David Henry Hwang Playwriting Institute, where I first studied playwriting, now holds East-West Wednesdays, which comprise discussions and performances, a showcase called Crazy Talented Asians, and various online performances. They just held their gala online because theater is highly affected, of course, and all the artists are, frankly, in a state of financial precarity now, as though they weren't before, but even worse. That was somewhat compromised by the aftermath of the George Floyd death and protests. They are located near police headquarters in Los Angeles, and the police were conducting tactical maneuvers outside. So the artistic director had no access to the theater where they'd originally planned the gala, and people had to kind of improvise some of those planned segments from home. I would say that streaming has allowed, the one thing that I think is great about the new situation, or the adaptations and creative responses to COVID, is that I think streaming allows a national and global audience so that people from all over the world could, in theory, view or participate in a reading or discussion, that it's not limited to people in the room. So, for example, Theater Moon Minneapolis, an Asian American theater, brought together current and former Bay Area artists to talk about the early days of Asian American theater. And that's sort of close to my heart because that's where I was first introduced to the possibilities of Asian American theater as an undergrad at Stanford. So, imagine going to see something where you saw someone who looks like you close enough to touch, and so on. So that was wonderful. And when they brought together artists from all over the country, they couldn't have done that, I think, on a shoestring budget, except virtually. So that part is great. And there have been interesting adaptations, like a few Zoom-based plays, where you imagine I think of the public imagining a family having Zoom conversations, or there was a production at the Geffen Playhouse where apparently the audience received, it was called The Present, I believe, and audiences received a little box in the mail. So they were kind of participating along with. So that's very creative, and I'm all for that. I've also seen calls for socially distanced plays. So that's another thought, how would you space people on stage and imagine an audience that was also practicing physical distancing. However, I have to say that nothing is like live performance. So for me, the most satisfying theatrical experience online, not surprisingly, has been seeing some of the National's archives. So the National Theatre Live has been releasing like a play a week, for free consumption online. So I watched Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller as Frankenstein and the monster, respectively. And I feel like this is great on the one hand because it at least gives you a sense, but it's partially because the National has money and they can afford the production value to film theater in a way that conveys some of the metaphoricity of theater. And yet, of course, it's a film, so it can capitalize on that as well. So, the shot of the chandelier and panning over the audience to get that sense of anticipation that a smaller theater could never afford. So I think, inequalities amongst theaters can be perpetuated in this moment. So that's, definitely an issue. And just quickly, in California, FYI, the financial precarity is exacerbated by AB 5, a bill designed for the gig economy, Uber and Lyft drivers, to make them employees so they will have benefits. For theaters, this would mean that they would have to pay creative staff, all the actors, a third more or something. And so for East-West players, I've heard just informally that this might mean $150,000 extra, which they do not have. So I worry about the continuing existence of live performance, to be honest, in this environment. So while there have been creative responses overall, I would say I'm more in the, postponement of live performance. And it makes me appreciate it even more.
It is just a very different experience, right? Both for performers and audiences. Yeah, completely.
So now what we have is, I believe in medium specificity. So now we have, the Zoom play or the Zoom experience. I'm frankly getting really tired of looking at my screen. I think we all are. And so, I long for the day, actually. It's like going to the theater. It's, quote unquote, breathing the same air. So dangerous in this moment. Yeah. So I look forward to the day when we can do that.
There also seems to be, and I mean, theater studies and performance studies scholars have written about this quite a lot. Part of that liveness of what's so interesting about live theater is putting bodies in physical proximity to each other, right?
Precisely.
Putting them in the same space. Because they interact in
they do.
Unpredictable ways, right?
Absolutely. And it's so that we live for, there's nothing like it. And so, unlike watching a film or TV, it's like the audience can affect the actors, and so it's that interchange. And, who's around you can affect your experience of a performance as well. So, yes, I miss all of that. Theater is the domain of metaphor as well, so I miss that too. In theater, as opposed to the more fly-on-the-wall quality of film or TV, just a change of lighting can signal a different period in history, or a stick can be all kinds of different things, sword, broom, horse, whatever. But you use your imagination. It's like the playful, childlike qualities that we all sort of bury. So they come to the fore once again, I think, in live performance.
You talk quite a lot about this power of liveness in your book, World Making, which I'd love to turn to because it's such a fantastic and compelling analysis of embodied theater. And you talk specifically about the way that race is embodied in the theater world in terms of economy, in terms of contracts, in terms of labor, in terms of the pleasure of performance, the pain of performance, perhaps as well. And one of the things that strikes me about this book is it is a book about and deeply produced through collaboration. It's not just you, right? So first of all, maybe what got you interested in studying theater through collaboration?
Well, theater is in itself a collaborative art. Lisa Peterson, the director, said it's not theater if you can do it by yourself. So But I think that there's something, it's a long story. So part of it has to do with representation or theater as a zone of what I call public existence and living as a minoritarian subject, never being mirrored, never imagining that theater or anything like it would be possible for those such as I in the academy. I'm someone who came very late to theater after tenure, actually. So I hope that your listeners can take heart and not be afraid to experiment. But going to see productions that had Asian American actors and written by Asian American playwrights, oh my God, a different vision of possibility that I'd never, what can I say? It just never even occurred to me. So that was part of it. And obviously theater is a collaborative art, makes you realize like how many people are involved in putting their artistry together to create something. I would say that anthropology itself is also premised on a certain kind of collaboratively produced knowledge through what I call corporeal epistemologies and what's known as participant observation. In my case, I kind of became what I study. So Ken Wissaker, the editor, called it participatory observation. And I think that there's something for, perhaps particularly for scholars who don't often collaborate, unlike in the sciences, for example. There was something alluring to me about being part of a production and seeing the ways in which people, again, could contribute their artistry and make something more wonderful and more exciting than you, the playwright, could ever imagine. And for me, also, there was just the pleasure of being among creative people and discovering that, perhaps I could do this. Perhaps I could write drama. So the collaborative aspect of theater has always been a draw and been exciting and thrilling. It can also be frustrating, and I write about that in the book as well, And I think that this perhaps speaks to our particular historical moment when people are talking about racial injustice and how difficult that may be. So when I worked on Anna Deavere Smith's Twilight Los Angeles in the wake of the 1992 uprisings, our backstage dramaturgical interactions were highly fraught. I mean, not even a year after the initial uprisings, LA was still in ashes. There were all kinds of racial tensions. Trying to negotiate those tensions and to create a production together while also trying to represent our quote unquote communities, to think about issues of racial quote unquote representation as being incredibly important as representing life on stage, as it were. It was a fraught, wonderful, it's once in a lifetime experience in a way. I always say that I've never cried so much or been so happy. That's what I worked on Twilight. So those aspects of collaboration, I think, also have to be marked. And also in this particular time that, there are calls for conversation and so on and so forth. And we can't think that those conversations are going to be power-free. So, those are some of the reasons that I think collaboration is incredibly important, and also how are we going to affect social justice, right? So that I think can only come from collective action. So it becomes, in this way, the theater also in its collaborative impulse becomes a kind of metaphor for other kinds of social action.
Interesting. I mean, it seems so apt in our current moment, right? I mean, we're recording this in early June, after many days of global protests and uprisings in response to police continuing to kill Black people with impunity. And it, in many ways, feels like deja vu, right? And as someone who thinks through these questions from the lens of theater and performance, I'd love to hear from you kind of what role do you see performance playing in either responding to, resisting, hopefully helping to end this kind of police violence and racism? What can theater and performance do?
Well, I think there are several levels to that question. So first, let's address, say, conventional notions of politics as, collective action, the kinds of demonstrations that we're seeing, which are incredibly important in affecting social change. So I want to draw attention to the theatricality of what is also happening, taking a knee or, lying on the ground and saying, I can't breathe, like those kinds of tactics, I think can be incredibly effective, or just the mass of people in quote unquote live performance going out to demonstrate their concern and their outrage at injustice. So there's that level. I think that theater and the arts generally are incredibly important in terms of representing a zone of public existence and of dealing with these kinds of issues in a way that moves people. So here I want to link political movement and the affective. And for example, in Anna Deavere Smith's work, her documentary theater has centered prominently on different kinds of uprisings, from Crown Heights to the Los Angeles uprisings in '92. Her latest piece called Notes from the Field, that was just rebroadcast on HBO in a timely way, deals with the school to prison pipeline, the criminalization and pathologizing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth. They don't get to have mischief. They're immediately put in institutions or incarcerated. So it's important. Her play also dealt with Freddie Gray and with the Charleston shootings. It's like, when will that end? I mean, it's sad that it's just all too familiar. But I think it is important for the arts to deal with these issues head on. So that's one way to offer an opportunity for us to reflect and to be moved. So to deal with these issues. But I think the arts tout court have a really important role in terms of, we could say, legitimation, again, as a zone of public existence, because I think who counts as human, who is allowed the putatively transcendent, noblest expression of the human spirit, supposedly, this is like PBS language, right, of the arts, is directly linked to notions of who counts as human in everyday life and worthy of respect. And so, the fact that I think people should take on everything, including opera, for example. It's like I go to the opera and there's, you expect the usual Eurocentricity, but must I see this Orientalist buffoonery, for example, or, whatever. So, they're acts of what I call affective violence. It isn't physical violence, right? So there is a qualitative difference, but Chester Pierce at Harvard was a mentor of mine who coined the term microaggression. It's like these small things. Sometimes it's full frontal aggression, right? But it leeches life. It can take days, weeks to recover in some sense from that, but it's really over a lifetime. It builds over a lifetime, right? So it leaches energy. So what enlivens and what leaches energy from people and diminishes them? So I think this diminishing becomes part of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls racism as vulnerability to premature death. And so that occurs in the prison system, obviously in terms of police violence, but it's linked very much to who counts as most fully human. I think what happens in opera and theater and so on and so forth, and it's still relatively unchallenged Eurocentricity, is directly linked to what's happening in the streets of Minneapolis or, Trump and, his designation of shithole countries and that kind of thing. Whose lives really matter. And that includes on stage and on the page in the realms of theory as well. So I think they're all linked in different ways. And when we think about the public sphere and going to the theater, there's the affective violence that can be experienced by minoritarian subjects, but there's also what I call racial affect that can also consolidate the dominant, whoever the dominant might be in that particular setting. So pleasure or enjoyment, I mean, I've been at all too many performances where it's like, what is the white audience laughing at? Or, it's like, I just want to get it out of here. So, and I write about that in my book. So, yeah, I think the arts are absolutely of a piece with, are implicated in the reproduction of these kinds of systems. And I hope that, minoritarian artists, and nothing is perfect, of course, nothing is going to be able to overturn, centuries of brutality and colonialism and so on in one production, but we can make small inroads. And so by thematizing these issues, by giving work to minoritarian actors, playwrights, to put their visions on stage, to provide alternatives, I think it's incredibly, incredibly important and can result in what I call in the book acts of reparative creativity. To repair, there's no such thing as a whole. We can't make it whole, right? But we can start to redress some of these structural violences and inequalities.
One of the things that strikes me about kind of using performance and theater, approaching them in this way, is how they make these issues accessible to different audiences, right? Because, different audiences will read a news story versus go to a play versus watch a film versus check in on social media, so these different kind of media forms can be used differently to get similar messages to people, but also in ways that they can connect with or that are going to be accessible to them where they are, right? And I know accessibility is something that you've thought quite a lot about in terms of your theater work, but also in terms of your scholarship and kind of how you approach teaching and your other kinds of work. So I'd love to kind of push a little bit on this notion of accessibility and maybe ponder together, perhaps, how some of these creative approaches to theater or approaches to highlighting the performative or performance aspects of racial justice work, how they fit with accessibility in terms of disability, in terms of class, in terms of all kinds of forms of difference. So that was a very roundabout, not quite question, but
no, I mean, it's making something me to think. To turn over in our minds. So let me just begin by, so I myself consider myself to be disabled in a certain way. I had heart surgery. I've never really recovered. So the number of my vertical hours is highly truncated. I am not normal in that way, although I think when I am vertical, I usually seem normal to people. So it's invisible. So what that means for me as a theater goer and also as a playwright or someone involved in theater is that I can't see a lot of plays. It's like an 8 p.m. curtain, if it goes to 11, is like really, really late, hard for me. I have to go into sleep training. And ditto, like the usual matinees at 2. So I can't, I'm still sleeping, you know what I mean, in my midday violent fatigue period. So that's difficult for me. So that's just in terms of the hours of accessibility to different audiences. And people laugh about matinees as being for the blue-haired, senior citizens. And I guess I'm with them now, except that I can't even go to the 2 p.m. performance. So when I had a recent reading, it seems like years ago, but it was in February, a stage reading of my play Seamless, I asked that the performance be changed to 4 p.m. so I could actually attend my own reading, And it also means that as a player, I love, both as an anthropologist and as someone involved in theater, part of it is the all-consuming aspect of it, that you're there like from morning till night, and it's, watching the process. And I even love watching tech, and people laugh at me. But that's part of the collaboration that you were talking about before, right? Just watching people like do what they do so well and so precisely. So so just for me, that's sort of part of it. So the hours of theater, certainly in terms of live performance, of course, that restricts things to who's in the room or who's, at that particular production, that particular moment. And so in a way, for those of us who are aficionados of theater, it means that if you've missed it, you've missed it. And so there's a great, and, Pei Phelan talks about theater as loss and, processes of mourning. And there have been nuanced revisions of that. Yes, there's repertoire, there remains, and so on and so forth, ephemera that outlast a particular performance. And yet, right, there is something to, if you've missed a production, for example, it's like the film of the production is not the same thing. So it's limited in terms of audience and scope. And arguably in that sense, at least, a film of the productions that are now available can give audiences access, quote unquote. However, I think that's pretty much a temporary thing because it's illegal to film theater really, except for an archival copy. So there's that. Class is definitely another thing. So, and, the urban. So how many theaters are in, rural areas? I mean, I grew up in rural areas. So do we have a theater? No. So there's that issue. Theater is expensive. Although, as I wrote about the Chicano Latino trio culture clash, and Rick Salinas once said that, Latino families may spend a lot of money to go to a sports event, for example, and theater may not cost that much, right? But it's still expensive, relatively speaking, and it doesn't have the audience, say, of a sports event. So that's definitely an issue as well. So when I've brought students to the theater, especially those who've never seen theater, I think for many it's been revelatory, not always in a good way. It's like, oh, it's so small.
But maybe they're used to thinking of sports stadiums.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Or thinking like the helicopter is going to come down from the sky like in Miss Saigon, unfortunately. So, but sometimes it's like, oh, they're right there, So it's like, oh, the right there-ness, I think is what I want for them and to appreciate. And so theaters almost always have a kind of educational arm that goes to schools, trying to cultivate audiences in all communities, having readings in public library. I'm just thinking of things that are happening in LA or have happened in public libraries in all different communities, different kinds of outreach, rush tickets that are $10 to $15, make it more accessible. But theater itself, I think, is obviously less distribution than television or YouTube or, other things. So that's something I think theater people talk about a lot. How do we continue to exist? And it's a one-of-a-kind experience, really. How do we promote that excitement and the allure of theater with, given smaller audiences, given the lack of funding? And particularly now with COVID and so on, that's an even more acutely urgent issue.
Well, I think this might actually dovetail really nicely into my next question, which is about the future and about what you want for that future, what kind of future you're helping to build. So obviously this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise. And with the guests, we get to do just that, kind of imagine the worlds that we're all working towards and collaboratively building. So I will ask you this giant question. And I know it is. It's huge, but I like ending with it because I don't think we get enough opportunities to talk about it. What's the world that you want? What's the world that you're working toward?
So I'd like a world in which the boundaries among the disciplines and among the arts, humanities, and sciences could be softened, where we could integrate different parts of ourselves and different modes of knowing. So in my work, I've been trying to organize a research cluster around creativity theory politics in terms of integrating these supposedly different domains, to create serious play and rigorous fun. And in my own written work, I've been trying to integrate those voices. So World Making, my latest book, is also a genre bender. So genre bending has been part of my mission from, my first book. So it's shaped like a 3-act play. It contains a full-length play. So this, I think it's, what should I say? I think it's a more accessible and fun read, but I think it's also a theoretically rigorous read. So to put those things together and for how can we integrate our lives and our work. So I want a world in which we could have changed the air, where we're not stuck in our institutional stuffy settings where we can't breathe, where we can bring in emotions from joy and delight and pleasure, to pain and rage, that those could all be part of it. And these would not be considered forms of weakness, but as part of being a quote unquote vulnerable subject. And I'd like to mobilize the capacity of the arts to move people in all aspects of our life, political, intellectual, and emotional.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of these ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thank you so much, Kathy. What a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Persad and myself, Kathy Hanneback. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes and transcript for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guests and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.